Hello, good morning, folks. How you doing today? Uh, Welcome to this session, folks. And today we're going to discuss an important topic, right? That every teacher face almost every single day. And it is how to select and adapt educational materials effectively, right? As teacher folks, we constantly choose textbooks, videos, worksheets, websites, AI tools, presentations, and many other resources. However, selecting a material is much more than simply choosing something that looks attractive, right? Remember that every material that we use influence the way a student understand the concept, participate in class, and achieve learning objective. And throughout this presentation, folks, we're going to explore the essential principles for selecting educational materials, the criteria we should use to evaluate them, and finally, several practical strategies for adapting materials to meet the needs of different learners. That is the most important, okay? By the end, folks, you will have a clearer framework for making truthful and evidence-based decision whenever you prepare your lessons, right? The objective for this lesson, folks, are to highlight the importance of selecting educational materials according to learner objective and learner's need. Remember that, as I said before, that before selecting, before creating, before adapting educational materials, we have uh, to be clear and taking into considerations the student's needs, the student's characteristics, right? Because based on that, we're going to do these ones, right? Another objective that we got for this session, folks, is to analyze the main criteria used to evaluate the quality and effectiveness of educational materials and to apply different adaptation strategies, as I mentioned before, to make educational materials more inclusive, right? And appropriate for diverse learners. And the last one, folks, to reflect critically on the role of educational material selection in improving teaching and learning outcomes. Again, those are the objectives that we're gonna meet through this session, folks. And we're going to analyze those strategies that we got when selecting and adapting educational materials, right? Now let's move on to this one, folks. Let's see. So here, as you can appreciate, we get a general overview, folks. And as we have discussed in previous sessions, we have said that educational material selection is an intentional process, right? It requires teachers to carefully analyze whether a particular resource actually supports learning instead of simply filling classroom time, right? Remember, folks, and something important that we have to take into account is that the materials that we're going to choose, remember that will have a direct impact on students' engagements, right? Comprehension, motivation, and even in their academic success. A well-selected resource can make a difficult topic easier to understand, while inappropriate one may create confusion or discourage learners, right? So that's why, folks, that in this presentation, we'll focus on three key areas, right? The first one, we'll examine the principles that guide good material selections, right? The second one, we'll discuss the criteria that help us evaluate whether a resource is appropriate, right? And finally, we'll explore different adaptation strategies that allow teachers to modify the existing materials so they better fit diverse classrooms, right? And ultimately, folks, Remember that our goal is to make informed pedagogical decisions rather than relying on the institution or personal preference, right? So remember that we're focused on the meaningful learning, right? Now, let's think, folks, why selecting materials is so important. Let me tell you, folks, and something that we have discussed in previous sessions. Remember that educational materials are much more than classroom resources, right? They actually shape students' learning experiences. Good materials, folks, provide appropriate support or what educational researchers often call scaffolding. That you're familiarized with this term, right? Scaffolding. And remember that they help students build knowledge progressively while maintaining motivation throughout the learning process, right? On the other hand, folks, poorly selected materials can create unnecessary difficulties. For example, for example, folks are reading text, right, with vocabulary that is far beyond students' level may increase frustration instead of promoting learning. So that's why that I said before selecting a material, we need to know the student's characteristics, student's language level, right? A student's need, because based on that, we have to use the proper vocabulary to be understood, right? Material selection, folks, also reflects our teaching philosophy, right? If we believe in active learning, collaboration, and critical thinking, then our material should encourage those same values. Finally, folks, I encourage you to reflect on your own educational experience and think about a material that really helps you learn something important. Think about that material and wonder yourself if they were effective for you, if that kind of material was engaging and if it was practical, if it was relevant to your life in professional life, right? Remember, folks, that when selecting educational materials, here, as you can appreciate on the screen, folks, there are five fundamental concepts we should always consider, right? So the first one, as you can see there, folks, is alignment. Remember that every material should support the learning objective and curriculum standards, right? If a resource doesn't contribute to the intended outcomes, then it probably isn't the best choice, right? So the second concept or key concept in material selection, folks, is authenticity. Here, something important that we have to take into account, it's that students learn better when materials connect classroom content with real life situations, right? Authentic materials make learning meaningful and relevant, remember. And this is aligned also with the CIFER levels, right? Something that we have been discussing in the other courses. The third one, folks, is accessibility. Remember that good educational resources should be useful by all of the learners, including students with different learning needs or disabilities. Something important, remember that we got some objective at the beginning of a class, right? So we need to achieve those objectives at the end of the class. Another important factor, folks, is the currency. Information changes constantly, remember, especially in today's digital world. Therefore, teachers should ensure that the materials they use contain accurate and updated information. So we have to be careful, folks, at the moment when selecting or when searching a really good website, because remember that the information must be accurate and reliable, right? And finally, folks, we get a pedagogical fit. Remember that And even an excellent resource may not be appropriate if it doesn't match the teaching methodology or classroom activities we plan to implement, right? This, as I said before, folks, here we got some of the fundamental concepts, right, that we should consider always when adapting and selecting educational materials, right? Here, folks, in this slide, as you can appreciate there, we have identified potential materials, and the next step is evaluating their quality, right? One important criteria, folks, is the content accuracy. As I said before, right? Remember that information should be reliable. So the website that you're gonna look for has be reliable, okay, has be valid, correct, and appropriate for students' academic level, right? We should also pay attention to the visual design, clear organization, readable prompts, appropriate images, and logical structure help students process information more effectively, right? Another consideration, folks, is student engagement. Remember that, and as I said before, good material should encourage participation rather than passive observations, right? Inclusivity, right, is equally important, folks. Remember that educational resources should represent diverse cultures, perspective, and experience while avoiding stereotypes or bias, right? And this is implemented in the CFR. Do you remember when we were reading those ones and listening and speaking skills? Now, let's move on to from theory to practicals. Imagine that you're preparing a lesson about climate change, okay? And you have several options. For example, a textbook chapter, a documentary, an online simulation, and a newspaper article, right? Will of them be equally effective? What do you think? I would say probably not, right? As teachers, we need to compare these resources using the evaluation criteria we've just discussed. We should ask ourselves questions like, such as, is the information accurate? So in the textbooks, is the information accurate? In the articles, is the information accurate? Is it appropriate for my students' level? Does it encourage critical thinking on students? Does it promote active participation? So we need to see those criteria, right? Before selecting them, before evaluating the materials. Because remember that at the end of the class, the material has to be effective, right? And something important that I said before, we need to achieve the objective that we posted at the beginning of the class because at the end they have to be achieved, right? It's also useful, folks, to organize our evaluation using a rubric or checklist, right? This makes the selection process more objective and allows just to justify why one material is more appropriate than other one, right? Don't forget that, folks, please. Now, in adoption strategy for diverse learners, remember that selecting good materials is only part of the process, right? Very often, we as teachers also need to adapt them. One strategy, folks, that we can use for adaptation those materials is the simplification, where we reduce complexity without changing the essential concepts. For example, if you got a document, a handout with 20 pages, remember that sometimes reading those kind of materials, it's boring, right? So we need to select the essential material, the key details on the materials, and we can use an a graphic organizer, right? Mind mapping, a fishbone, a Venn diagram, etc. Depends on what are we doing. For example, if we're working with compare and contrast, the most appropriate for that it's the Venn diagram, right? Another strategy, folks, that we got is the elaboration, which means adding examples, explanation, or additional support to help students understand difficult ideas, right? Sometimes reorganizing information folks into a different sequence improve comprehension. Teachers can also supplement materials by adding videos, graphic organizer, practice exercises, or even interactive activities, right? And finally, folks, when a resource simply doesn't meet students' need, substitution may be the best option. Remember that the activities that you implement in your lesson plans, and at the end you realize that those activities are not achieving your goals, you can change it immediately. Okay, remember that one part, one element, one element of the lesson plan that we got at the end is the observation. You need to specify there why the activities has been changed, right? The key idea, folks, is that educational materials should serve learners, not the other way around, right? Let's see the adaptation of the educational material for different learners' needs. Remember, folks, that every classroom is diverse and students learn in different ways. Visual learners often benefits from diagrams, infographics, charts, and educational videos, as I said before, right? Auditory learners usually understand concepts better through discussions, podcast, and verbal explanation. And also, we got the kinesthetic learners need opportunities to interact physically with learning through hands-on activity experiments on simulation. Sometimes it's really good to implement some activities like this one. And I don't know if you remember, folks, when we're talking about some teaching methods, English language teaching methods, and one of them was the TPR. So TPR is the most appropriate for kinesthetic activities, right? Also, folks, I would say that teachers should also consider students with disabilities by providing accessible formats such as digital documents, audio versions, or large print materials. In English language classroom, folks, um, let me tell you that learners may also need vocabulary support, simplified instructions, and cultural explanation to better understand the content, right? Adapting materials in these ways, folks, create a more inclusive learning environment where every student has the opportunity to succeed, right? Now, something important that we're living today, folks, and it is the technology and the digital material adaptation. Remember that technology has transformed the way teachers design and adapt educational materials, and digital tools allows us to modify content quickly based on a student's progress and feedback, right? Learning management systems make it easier to distribute uploaded resources, monitor participation, and organizing learning materials efficiently, right? Open educational resources, folks, or OER, are especially valuable because they provide free materials that teachers can legally adapt and customize. So, on the platform, folks, you will find some document related to these open educational resources. However, folks, technology should always be used thoughtfully, right? We should ensure accessibility by including captions, transcripts, adjustable text sizes, and appropriate color contrast. Most important, Technology should complement, not replace, folks. Complement meaningful interaction between teachers and students, right? Being a reflective teacher means continuously evaluating our own instructional decisions, right? After using educational materials, it's important to ask ourselves whether they truly supported learning. Did they encourage participation? Were they inclusive? Did they unintentionally reinforce stereotypes or biases? What do you think? As student feedback, folks, it's also extremely valuable because learners often identify threats and weaknesses that teachers may overlook. Collaborating with colleagues, with your students, allows us, with your peers, with your classmates, allows us to exchange ideas, discover new resources, and improve our teaching practices, right? Finally, folks, documenting our selection adaptation decision creates a valuable record that helps us refine future lessons and continue growing professionally, right? To conclude, folks, selecting educational materials, I would say that it's one of the most important professional responsibilities teachers have, right? Today's presentation has shown that effective material selection requires thoughtful planning, careful evaluation, and continuous adaptation. Rather than choosing resources simply because they are popular or visually attractive, we should always consider how they support our learning objective and address our students' need, right? As you prepare your future plans, I encourage you to evaluate at least one educational resource using the criteria we've discussed today and think about possible adaptation that could make it more effective. What I'm saying this, folks, because remember that you're taking another course with me and you need to take into account this one, right? Remember that great teaching is not about finding the perfect materials, it's about making informed decisions that help every learner achieve success, right? Thank you very much, folks, for your time, for your attention, and I hope these ideas support your future teaching practice, right? If you got any doubts, if you got some questions, we can discuss in the next session, right? See you, folks, and please try to complete the individual assignment that you got on the platform, and you have to submit such assignment in the module of tareas, right? See you. Bye bye.